Thank you all for waiting. I'm really sorry about these technical problems. They always seem to happen. I don't know if we're going to be able to show the short film because there's tech problems, but if not, next time. I'm going to talk about three groups of people who have the highest rates of smoking, and they're not falling, actually, and they haven't fallen for a really long time. Other demographics have seen dramatic falls, but we haven't. And I'm talking about people who are homeless. So among people who are homeless, the rate of smoking is about 75%. 75% of people who are homeless in the United States smoke cigarettes. That's really, really high. Among veterans, very high rates of smoking. So 24% of veterans smoke, and I don't have time to talk about it, but the military actually has a very long history with the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry has given major discounts to the military for cigarettes. At one point, soldiers had rations of cigarettes per day, and I don't think it takes much to wonder why soldiers would want to smoke. The fear and anxiety of being in war and the desire to not feel that. Nicotine works really well for that. Again, no surprise to folks here. People who have mental health problems have very high rates of smoking. People who have depression, they have anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, we see very high rates of smoking. Among people who have schizophrenia, they have the highest rates of smoking, estimated anywhere between 80 and 90% of people with this particular diagnosis smoke cigarettes. One British study I was looking at to prepare for this talk, it showed that among people who are institutionalized and they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, 93% of the men were smokers, and 82% of the women were smokers. In general, people who have this diagnosis, they tend to smoke a lot more cigarettes per day. They're really attracted to high tar and no or low filtered cigarettes. And really, this is a group of people who are highly addicted to nicotine. And so the question is, why? Why is there this affinity of nicotine among people who have this particular diagnosis? And there's two things that are going on. So nicotine improves cognitive impairments, and people who have schizophrenia have cognitive deficits. In particular, they have deficits in attention, the ability to focus, and they have problems with memory. So when someone has schizophrenia and they smoke, these cognitive impairments are dramatically improved. And you can imagine the quality of your life if you couldn't remember things and if you couldn't pay attention. So the desire to take nicotine in order to have your brain functioning so you can be part of the world is just enormous. And of course, people do it at great risk to their health. The other thing that nicotine does is there's a process that takes place in the brain, in everybody's brain, not just people who have this particular diagnosis. It is called sensory gating or sensory filtering. And what this sensory filtering does is it prevents an overload of irrelevant information from getting into the brain. And so you really need that because we live in environments that have a lot going on. And so what researchers have found is in some people who have schizophrenia, not all, but many, this sensory gating, this ability to filter, is very impaired. And they think it can, when it's impaired, it can lead to auditory hallucinations. And so they have studies that show that after a person with this diagnosis smokes, sensory gating is vastly improved. It gets better. And so again, if you want to talk about quality of life, right? If you can't make sense of your environment, that's very distressing. And the nicotine corrects for that. So these are just two reasons why people with this particular diagnosis smoke. And I don't actually recommend to people that I work with who have this diagnosis for them to stop smoking, because they decompensate and their life gets worse. And I recommend that they transition to vaping, or if they don't want to vape, to another nicotine replacement. I believe that there's some people with mental health diagnoses, they will want to maintain their use of nicotine. And now with vaping, we have a way to do it that is 95% safer according to Public Health England. Okay, people who use drugs, illicit drugs, very high rates of smoking cigarettes, and the legal drugs, alcohol. A large percentage of head and neck cancers are a result of heavy smoking and heavy drinking. So the legal and illegal substance, people who have chronic and persistent addictions to drugs, we call it, right, dual diagnosis, we call it co-occurring, and then let's put smoking in there as well. People who are taking methadone, the rates of smoking among this group, 80 to 90%, at least in the United States, 80 to 90% of people who are in methadone programs smoke cigarettes as well. And then the majority of adults who go into rehabilitation, go into drug treatment, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, smoke cigarettes. So these are the groups that we're talking about. Homeless, people with mental health diagnoses, and people who use drugs. I want people to I don't have time to go into this right now. I'm going to talk about this more towards the end. But the tobacco industry has known about the high rates of smoking among these three groups for decades. They've done research into why. For example, people with schizophrenia use so much nicotine they know. I feel like the tobacco industry knows everything about smokers. They've done a lot of research, and the documents that we have uncovered show this. And this is one paper that showed the tobacco industry partnered with homeless shelters. They partnered with advocacy organizations for people with mental health problems, and they gave money to these organizations, and they lobbied together for things like they were opposed to stopping smoking in psychiatric facilities. The families of loved ones who were in psychiatric institutions made the case, smoking helps my loved one, you can't ban smoking. And so they worked with the industry, and so this population, people with mental health problems, drug users, and homeless, they make up 40 to 45% of the tobacco market in the United States. They're still one of the biggest users of tobacco products. And so this is the slide, this is the number that should shock everybody and kind of lend another, just more urgency to actually doing something about this problem. I mean, can you imagine if 25 years were taken off your life? What are the things that you wouldn't do? And why do we allow this to continue? Right? Why do we allow this? And I think it has to do with the fact that, at least in the United States, people who have mental health problems, drug users, and the homeless, society doesn't really care about them too much. They're not on the priority list, certainly not with Donald Trump in office. They're not a priority for his administration. But this has been going on for a long time. It predated Donald Trump. I'm not going to blame him. I don't want to hashtag going out about me because I've criticized the President of the United States. So I want to show a film, but I'm not sure if we can do that. We cannot do that. Okay. I will just briefly tell you what the people that I interviewed in that film said. And basically, it's very straightforward. People use nicotine to deal with anxiety. If you've ever been anxious, and you take a drag of a cigarette, within 10 seconds or less, you feel less anxious. That's pretty incredible. When you're depressed, nicotine helps with depression. Nicotine helps with weight loss, and for people who are on psychotropic medications, and some of the people I work with are on a lot of them, one of the side effects is weight gain. So to use nicotine for appetite suppression is huge. So nicotine works for many mental health problems that people have. It also helps people with boredom. It helps with, as I said, for people who have schizophrenia, but in other diagnoses, it helps with energy and attention and focus. It gets people going. Get up in the morning, you have a cigarette with your coffee, and then at night, you have a cigarette with your drink, and you're relaxed, and you're ready to go off to sleep. So that's basically what the people in the film would have told you. I want to say something about stigma, because I think that it's much harder to help people, especially vulnerable groups, when you stigmatize them. And we do that with smokers. And so there's lots of imagery out there that shame smokers. You're a moron, you're stupid, you're basically committing suicide. You know, you've got ashes for brains. You're really, you're essentially an idiot. We see, this is, when I was in Portugal, I took some photos of cigarette packages there, but this is happening all over the world, right? Putting these gruesome, grotesque photos on cigarette packages in an attempt to what? Scare people into not smoking. And it's disgusting. And I'm disgusted with public health officials and people involved in this. This does not help people. Scaring people doesn't stop them from smoking, especially these vulnerable groups for whom nicotine really, really works. You've probably seen some of these packages, right? This was in Hungary. I bought a package of cigarettes. So this is saying to men, you might not be able to achieve an erection if you smoke. So it's a sexual shaming of men. I don't think this is a thing that would stop men from smoking, because then they would have already stopped by now. I don't think it's going to work. But this kind of shaming, and these are a series of photos. These were on the subway in New York City where I live. So they did a campaign. They were on the train cars. There were posters along the platforms. And so this is what I call the blaming. You got cancer, you smoked, you have nobody to blame but yourself. This is classic victim blaming. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. There are good reasons why people can't stop, or it's very difficult. And these campaigns don't help. And I think we have to stop using these kinds of imageries and stop with the shaming and the blaming and the scaring. And I find it's really interesting because with other groups of people who have significant health problems, we've actually gone in the opposite direction. We've tried to destigmatize, right? People who have mental health problems, depression, anxiety, we want to talk about it as a society and humanize people and say, millions of people have these problems, you're not alone. We've done it with, back when HIV was much more prevalent and there was a lot of stigma and discrimination against people who had HIV. We worked really hard to end that stigma against people who are living with HIV. And I don't think we're doing that with smokers. I think it's still okay to shame, blame, and scare and stigmatize smokers. And again, it doesn't help people change this behavior when you act that way towards them. But this is just classic stuff that is still being put out there. It makes our job harder, I would argue. So this is a quote by Paul Newhouse that really, just read it and then I'm going to say something about it. So I like the idea that nicotine is the perfect psychotropic drug for some people. And I think we should think about it that way. It's the perfect psychotropic drug for some people. We have lots of psychotropic drugs out there, right? Prescriptions, lots of prescribed medications for people with mental health problems. And they have a lot of side effects, metabolic syndromes that are really serious. But nicotine doesn't have that problem. Nicotine is actually a very clean drug. It's been seen for decades as a dirty drug because of the way it's delivered through combustible tobacco. So we need to rethink how we think about nicotine. We don't think about that when somebody's getting a patch, right? I'm talking about, people have problems with vaping, right? It's a nicotine delivery system. And when you look at the patch or the gums, people don't have problems with that, right? They think that's okay. It has to do with the delivery device. I think part of this argument that we're having about vaping is because people are inhaling it and they think it's like smoking and it's going to lead to all these problems. But delivered other ways, not so much a problem, right? So let's think about nicotine as a medication. For some people, it is a medication. Okay, the question is this. We have a number of challenges if we're going to help people make the transition to electronic cigarettes, and that's what I want to happen. We can change up that number of 25 years lost if we can help people who want to transition to vaping. But I have to say, in my work with drug users and people who are homeless and people with mental health problems, and they're often all three in one, most people will say, I want to stop smoking. They realize the problems they're going to have or they're already having, but they want the nicotine still. So what are we going to do to help, despite all these challenges? And when we think about the challenges, we have to look at the social determinants of this behavior and what those challenges are. So we know that, at least in the United States, the overwhelming majority of people who are smoking are also less educated, they're poor, disproportionately people of color who are oppressed, don't have access to the same amount of resources. Unemployment is really high among people who smoke. And certainly when I've worked with people who have mental health problems in community settings, housing, my coworkers and I, we would often say to each other, if the people we work with could just have a job, they would cut down on their smoking, right? Because they would be part of, they would be going into a workplace where you can't smoke, and they would be in a culture that doesn't support smoking. But we don't let people with mental health problems into the workforce. They're tremendously discriminated against. So we're up against a lot, the social determinants of smoking. We're up against that when we're helping these vulnerable groups transition. The first thing, not rocket science here, tobacco harm reduction vaping support groups. We do them now, right, with people who are using other drugs. We have depression support groups, all kinds of mental health support groups. We have to start vaping groups. And this is the place where people can talk about their smoking, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, what it means to transition, if they're ready, giving each other support. And in community housing for people with mental health problems, they're there a lot, right, because they're not working. So there's lots of opportunities to offer these groups. Homeless shelters, a little more problematic because people are often kicked out during the day. They have to find somewhere else to hang out. Sometimes they can stay, but I think homeless shelters really need to think seriously. I mean, people are coming there to sleep. They can certainly offer groups there. So this is a photo I took in Portugal. They have methadone vans in Portugal. And this was really amazing because in the United States, we have a methadone system it's a clinic system. It's very difficult to get in. And in Portugal, they have vans. So the idea is you take the drugs to the people who need them. You meet them where they're at. You don't have them come to a clinic if they don't want to. And so what we can do is we can partner with methadone vans and not only offer methadone, but offer electronic cigarettes. I don't know if you have methadone vans in England, but The other thing is just a vaping van. You just have a van and you paint an electronic cigarette on the side of it, and you go to the communities with the highest rates of smoking, and you open the doors and you say, come as you are, try some electronic cigarettes. And you're there every week at the same time in the same place. So the only thing that's missing from on the side of this van is electronic cigarettes. They're offering everything for people, and electronic cigarettes should be part of that. The other thing we do in the United States is there are vans that go and pick people up who are homeless and take them to shelters, and they offer food and coffee for folks. And so, you know, have a sandwich and have a cigarette afterwards. Let's offer that along with food and a ride to the homeless shelter. So the idea is we take the vans into the communities that are most affected. And we know where drug users are, we know where they hang out, we know where the homeless hang out, and they're often people who have mental health problems. So there's no problem finding these folks, right? We know where they are. So it's still Stoptober, and partnering with vape shops, getting to know the owners, and having the people you work with in your agencies go to the vape shop, meet the owner, and talk about the products and trying them. One of the things that we know is that often the first electronic cigarette you use is not the one you end up using. People have to try several different types. It's enormously confusing. There's been this incredible proliferation of devices. It's really amazing. But I think for some people, at least I know that I work with, the simpler, the better. And vape shop owners know a lot about their products, and they can educate people, and it becomes a place where you go to learn how to use it if you're having problems. And then you also ask the vape shop owner for discounts, deep discounts, because the people, at least again, that I work with don't have a lot of money, and they want to do good. I mean, I've met quite a few vape shop owners and talked about the population I work with, and they want to help. So don't be afraid to ask for that. Also, as part of this, you could develop a peer education support program where one person who is transitioned helps the next person, and then helps the next person. Who better to help somebody transition than a person who's done it themselves? And I've seen this work really, really well. So I just want to go back to the tobacco companies. I talked about how they've had a long relationship with homeless shelters, with social service agencies. They understand the market. They understand everything. And this was in 1994. This is a very famous photograph. Excuse me, these are the heads of 7 tobacco companies, and they all raised their hands and swore that nicotine was not addictive. They said it's not addictive, and they were lying, of course. They knew it was, and that's why they like this product so much. The profits are astronomical because people do become addicted. Now, to be sure, millions of people become unaddicted in a variety of ways. And so I think what we have to do is we have to go to the tobacco companies who have made so many profits off of the most vulnerable people in our society, the people who really need nicotine to function well. And we have to say to them, you are going to give free or discounted product to these groups of people. Think of it as reparations if you want to. Think about it as good corporate responsibility. But this is the market that you have made so many profits off of, and so many people have died. And you have to step up and do the right thing now. And you know, again, think of it as giving back to people. And again, I think that for many people, they're going to want to maintain their use of nicotine. And so they're going to have customers for years and years and years. I know that the tobacco companies are already making these calculations in terms of smokers switching to electronic cigarettes, and will they continue to use electronic cigarettes? I think these groups will continue to use. I don't think the quit rates are going to be very high. If they quit, that's great. But again, I see nicotine for some people as a maintenance medication, very much as I see methadone and buprenorphine. Some people will need to use it for into the foreseeable future, and there's nothing wrong with that. So this is what we have to do. We have to make electronic cigarettes easier and cheaper to get than a pack of Newports, or put Camels in there, or whatever the brand is. We have to make it easier and cheaper to get the electronic cigarettes. And finally, what we're doing actually is we're building a culture of vaping to take the place of the culture of smoking, which is incredibly entrenched among drug users and people who have mental health problems and the homeless. We're actually trying to change the culture. Thank you.